Now we come to another Irish novelist, William Carleton. The reputation of William Carleton as Ireland's first great modern recorder in the English language of a Gaelic-speaking peasantry seemingly excludes him from the conventions of the largely Anglo-Irish tradition of big house fiction. Historian Oliver MacDonagh emphasizes the striking differences between those novelists like Edgeworth who write about the big house from within the Thames walls and those observing it from without. Thus, for MacDowell, Carleton depicts landlordism with Marxist indignation, not Chekhovian melancholy. Certainly, such indignation shaped much of Carleton's work, but after a youthful immersion in traditional Irish society and an adult career working for Unionist periodical as a Protestant convert, Carleton also appropriates conventions being established by middle-class or gentry novelists of the big house. In his incendiary attack on the Irish land system in Valentine McCluchy, as in his short story, The Poor Scholar, the return of the good landlord mirroring the classic redemptive scene Edgeworth staged in The Absentee, reverses the agent's cruelty and injustice. In The Poor Scholar, as a returned absentee landlord contemplates his abandoned and mouldering big house, an image charged with a similar symbolic association of mismanagement and loss for Edgeworth and Lever. Carleton's Big House novel, The Sequenters of Castle Sequenter, depicts a familiar gentry estate, shamefully neglected and convivially debauched, virtually a mid-19th century castle recreant. Despite the growing indignation, its narrator Randy O'Rourke directs towards the riotous profligacy of the landlord. This novel again suggests the shaping role of a range of existing literary conventions. Randy elicits considerable sympathy for the improvident and reckless landlord class he serves and judges. A household tutor and a son of the estate bailiff, he offers, as does Edgeworth's Teddy Kirk, a servant's view of the big house. However, Carleton's narrator is an upstanding intimate of the improvident squanders, attempting to rescue and reform his employers rather than sycophantically defer to them. The novel's most pressing ideological agenda, its condemnation of ruling class neglect during the famine, cannot be contained by a single dramatically conceived narrative voice. Instead, the sequence of Castle Sequender becomes clogged with stretches of interpolated and unassimilated authorial commentary and propaganda. Detailed statistics of famine, eviction, parliamentary reports and condemnation of secret societies. Pay attention those bu ifadelere biraz dikkat edin. Vying with this flood of unassimilated data, Randy's pity for his improvident landlord emerges. Sequinder is not a man of bad heart and impossible not to like, even as Randy describes the arrogant Mrs. Squander, forced to sleep on a borrowed bed as creditors strip the over-mortgaged house of its furniture. He finds parallels between the disposition of the gentry and the tenantry. The pheasant narrator compares the woeful decline and dissolution of Castle Squander to the decline and dissolution of the country, a landscape plunged in the worst horrors of the famine, hunger, disease, eviction, mass deaths. Pay attention to those points. By insisting on such mutual suffering rather than merely dwelling on the obvious differences between the experiences of the ruined gentry and the brutally evicted tenants, Randy invokes a shared racial disaster. Thus, Carleton's radical critique of the landlord's sons as brutal evictors, sexual marauders, of peasant girls or extravagant wastrels is moderated by literary conventions developing among upper or middle class Protestant writers. Moreover, the general instability of the squanders of Castle Squander, alternately polemic and dramatic novel, underscores the shaping role of ideology on the genre. Throughout the 19th century, now we come to Big House Gothic. Allegorical Gothic motifs invoking the anxiety of a beleaguered ascendancy interact with, with and intrude upon the developing conventions of a more transparently realistic Big House fiction. As one reader has put it, 19th century Ireland can be seen as a living Gothic. Pay attention. For a post-Union ruling class, slowly acknowledging its failure to maintain hegemony over a newly emboldened tenantry. Proprietaries of rural estates were surrounded by the material and psychic conditions encouraging a turn to the Gothic. Crumbling mansions, anxiety anticipated violence, and casts of eccentrics, marooned in their walled denseness and condemned by their isolation from the surrounding community. Certainly, the political insecurity conveyed by Gothic conventions expresses, often in distorted or sublimated forms, the reality of Anglo-Irish conditions during the long century of local violence accompanying the development of the Big House novel. Maria Edgeworth's neglected estate and declining social class in Castle Recrant, as well as her plots of disinherited heirs and missing wills in Anu and the absentee, already suggests a convergence between Gothic conventions and ascendancy preoccupations. Charles Maturin and Sheridan Le Fanu, and later in the century Bram Stoker and Somerville and Rose, developed full-blown Protestant Gothic novels, deploying a range of characteristic motifs. Deranged and demonized landlords, settings in decaying houses, a growing class obsession with racial pollution and cultural decline, as well as sadistic threats against helpless young women. Although Melville the Wanderer reads as phantasmagoria of sectarian and sadomasochistic violence in the hidden dungeons of Spain, India, and the South Sea, Charles Maturin frames his Gothic Tour de France with scenes set in a decaying house on the Irish coast. A familiar motif in the realistic Big House tradition, the Melmoth estate confiscated land bestowed on a 17th century Cromwellian is in ruins. The lodge is collapsing, the avenue reduced to mud, the garden desolate. The dying landlord protests his impoverishment at the hands of his brutalized vampire-like retainers, and the ancestral absentee Melmoth assumes the role of a lurid satanic protagonist. Such a framing strategy underscores how even a strikingly unprovincial Gothic Irish novel retains a specifically local and class-bound anxiety. Although Big House properties managed to hold on to much of the island's property until the late 19th century Land Acts, already in the century's early decades, a fictional landlord dies burdened by the corrupt sources of his power and by premonitions of future loss, illustrating the continuing relationship between Gothic conventions and those of the Big House novel. Irish writers after Maturin, for example Sheridan Le Fanu, Somerville and Rose, and Bram Stoker, continued to create doomed satanic landlords residing in their encumbered, decaying, or strikingly archaic mansions.